Welcome back to Dentro La Storia. Today we will talk about a legal case that has influenced the collective imagination of the United States, and in some ways also the Western world, so partly Europe, for decades and decades. A case of espionage, of passing nuclear secrets, a legal case, a case of the public execution of a married couple, but also a case with many very strange facets, with things said and unsaid, with testimonies without foundation, without evidence. A case that is still debated today, a case involving a very serious accusation of espionage against one's own country, but which has been reconsidered over time. Put into context and substantially reduced to a much less serious case, to the point that even today people ask themselves, did Julius and Ethel Rosenberg deserve to die in the electric chair? Or maybe it was simply the atmosphere of that period, the early 1950s in the United States of America, that played a role. The pressure of public opinion and the interests of certain politicians pushed for that outcome, for an exemplary capital sentence for two ordinary citizens. Today we will try to shed light on this case that still shakes people's consciences. Before we begin, the legal case of the Rosenberg spouses, Julius and Ethel, holds a decidedly prominent place in the history of the United States in the 20th century. Arrested in 1950, sentenced to death the following year, and with the sentence carried out in 1953, all for the accusation of espionage in favor of the Soviet Union. The Rosenbergs were the only American civilians put to death for espionage in peacetime, a rare case. From the very beginning, their case went beyond the boundaries of criminal law to take on a political, symbolic, and cultural significance of exceptional intensity. The Rosenberg case was not just about espionage, it was a true paradigm of the Cold War and American society, something in which national security, ideology, and social fear are intertwined. The politics of justice, we already talked about this in part in the video we made a few months ago dedicated to the Red Scare, the fear of communism. You can find it on the channel. Today we will try to shed more light on the story of the Rosenberg couple. First of all, let's talk about them. Julius Rosenberg was born in 1918 on May 12th in New York to a family of Russian immigrants and grew up in a working-class neighborhood. Julius Rosenberg developed a strong interest in radical politics. He joined the Young Communist League, the youth organization of the Communist Party of the United States. After graduating from Seward Park High School, Julius continued his engineering studies at City College of New York. He became an electronics engineer right in that environment. He met some people with political views similar to his own. Among them were the Greenglass brothers, and from there, his future wife Ethel and Morton Sobel, a future asset in espionage. In 1939, at the age of 21, Julius and Ethel got married. Ethel Greenglass became Ethel Rosenberg. And besides sharing their everyday life, they also shared their political commitment within the communist movement. A commitment that lasted until 1945 when Rosenberg, working in the United States Army Signal Corps as a civilian engineer dealing with communications, was fired. That Red Scare was beginning to emerge. I had already mentioned earlier, recalling the video we made in November, but that's not all. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. During that period, in addition to having children, first Michael Allen, born on March 10, 1943, and then Robert Henry, born on May 14, 1947, they continued to frequent circles close to the American far left when the two start to argue. Both about the new weapon of the United States, the atomic bomb detonated at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and about the future role of the world. Amid the now clear opposition between the United States of America and its allies and the Soviet Union, something begins to change. The two do not know it, but from the end of the Second World War onward, the intelligence agencies of the United States of America and the counterintelligence agencies of Great Britain have started a project that changes names several times. The most well-known name. The Venona Project is a project for decrypting encrypted messages that the various services exchange in order to try to identify, intercept, and arrest undercover Soviet spies. Julius Rosenberg continues to frequent Communist Party circles. And yes, Julius Rosenberg does pass on information, but it's information that is, all in all, of little importance. It's not enough. In July 1950, Julius and Ethel are arrested. Why? Because they are accused of passing on nuclear secrets. It's no coincidence that shortly before the Rosenbergs' arrest, the Soviet Union announced its first nuclear test. What seemed to be a weapon exclusive to the United States until then was also replicated beyond the Iron Curtain. For this reason, Julius and Ethel became targets, both of the public administration and, of course, of the justice system, as well as of public opinion, who sees in the two of them traitors, people who betrayed their own country to serve another master. The fact that Julius Rosenberg's wife's brother, David Greenglass, worked as a machinist inside the Manhattan Project is the key element, the turning point of the whole affair. A story that is heavily influenced by McCarthyism, the witch hunt promoted by Senator Joseph McCarthy, the famous anti-American activities, the investigative committee, the arrests, the accusations, the blacklists. It's something that shakes America, and it's something that will definitely change the world. The case against the Carnegie Rosenbergs is based largely on the testimony of Ethel's brother, David Greenglass. As we mentioned, a technician at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. Along with David Greenglass, his wife Ruth also testifies. It's the two of them. They claimed that the Rosenbergs passed nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union. But how? In what way? And what secrets? All of this remains in a drawer. It is not stated publicly, officially, in order to maintain the necessary secrecy during an extremely critical time for the United States. After losing the uniqueness of the atomic bomb, the United States is afraid. They fear that the war against the Soviet Union could really happen, and that it would be fought under conditions that would make it a completely destructive post-war. The trial of the Rosenberg couple lasts very little. Despite requests for clemency first to President Truman, then to his successor Heike Eisenhower, the two spouses are sentenced to death. The sentence is carried out in the electric chair on June 19, 1953 at Sing. And this is where the real story of the Rosenbergs ends. The children are put up for adoption, to the point that they even change their last name, taking that of their adoptive parents. But something changes within our narrative, because if at first the American public opinion willingly accepts the official version, the one given by the government, and the trial results, pretending not to see the serious shortcomings within the trial, especially against Ethel, who in fact had never been involved in any of her husband's work activities. Here, between the 1960s and the 1970s, the changed political and cultural climate within the United States itself produces a first significant turning point. McCarthyism ends with the 1950s, when it is discovered that Joseph McCarthy is simply obsessed with his own ghosts, also fueled by alcoholism. Then the Vietnam War calls into question the United States' military supremacy, and the emergence of a new, more libertarian current of thought encourages growing distrust towards state and military institutions. And it is in this context, in the midst of the Vietnam War, between the 1960s and 1970s, that the Rosenberg case becomes the subject of a reinterpretation, a more careful, more systematic reinterpretation. Historians and legal scholars begin to distinguish between procedural truth and historical truth, and they critically analyze what had happened. A fundamental contribution to all this is offered by Walter Emilian Schneier. Their report, Invitation to Inquest, questions the entire accusatory framework of the trial, particularly with regard to Ethel Rosenberg, who appears to be what she really was, an unsuspecting victim. At this stage, a clearer distinction is made between the responsibility of Julius and that of Ethel Rosenberg. While Julius's awareness of what he had done, and therefore his culpability, was considered plausible by many scholars, with Ethel, the issue became increasingly fragile. The real transformation of this debate occurred with the declassification, At the end of the 1980s of the materials left from the Venona project, and then starting in 1991 with the partial opening of the Soviet archives, for the first time, historians were able to have full access to intelligence sources independent from the trial. The decrypted cables from the Venona project indicate with reasonable certainty that Julius Rosenberg was indeed a Soviet agent, and he was involved in the transmission of military information, but he did not have access to information regarding the Manhattan Project or the development of the atomic weapon. This discovery had made the claim of his complete innocence untenable, but it had also required a thorough review of what had happened before. Julius Rosenberg had played a minor role compared to other agents, and his contribution to the Soviet nuclear program was extremely limited. He only transmitted direct knowledge from his own work in the fields of electronics and engineering. In the Venona cables, there is a complete lack of documentary evidence against Ethel Rosenberg, who had never had any operational involvement. Her only fault, if it can be called that, was marrying Julius and being the sister of David Greenglass, who years later in old age would confess. Greenglass had tried to save himself and his wife Ruth. They were the first suspects in passing nuclear secrets to the Soviets. And to lighten their own situation, they bargained prison for fabricated charges, increased or even completely invented against his sister and brother-in-law. But David Greenglass's mission came too late to save his sister and brother-in-law, who were sent to the electric chair with excessive ease. And they were pointed out by the American press and part of public opinion as the worst traitors America had ever dealt with. In the 21st century, so in recent years, the historiography on the Rosenberg case has shifted to a post-revisionist approach. The central issue is no longer guilt in the strict sense. We have understood that Ethel was innocent and Julius was partially guilty, but rather how the American judicial system functioned in a context of ideological emergency. Particular attention has been given to the figure of Ethel Rosenberg, interpreted as a victim of judicial coercion aimed at obtaining her husband's cooperation. She was simply a bait, but as bait she had to be sacrificed. The Rosenberg case has become an object of study for the history of memory. In the United States, the Rosenberg case occupies an ambiguous position, sometimes marginalized because it is bothersome. It is embarrassing to have to remember what happened. The fact that, to protect itself, the state sacrificed two of its own citizens who could have served a different sentence, but who were singled out as an example to be punished at all costs. In Europe, we have a different way of thinking, and we have always seen the Rosenberg case as a true symbol of McCarthyism. Sometimes we even simplified all of this, but we weren't very far from reality. In any case, the Rosenberg case shows with particular clarity how the production of historical knowledge is extremely influenced by the political context, the availability of information sources, and the questions asked, at that time, but also afterwards. More than 70 years after what happened, the case is no longer a judicial enigma. We know everything. We know who Julius Rosenberg associated with. We know what field he worked in. We know what he actually passed on to the Soviet Union. We know that his wife was completely uninvolved and innocent. But the case represents a historical laboratory for studying the complicated and very, very delicate relationship between democracy, power, and fear. The Rosenberg affair doesn't just question the past of the Cold War, but above all raises issues that are still relevant today, issues that concern the functioning of justice in emergency situations, and the ability of democratic societies to resist the temptation to go too far, to overstep, in the pursuit of justice at all costs, in the desire to find someone guilty no matter what, and, of course, to punish them in the most cruel and exemplary way possible. And this is the unhealthy legacy of the Rosenberg case. Could there have been another ending? Maybe yes. Who can say today? But if we analyze the situation in America at the end of the 40s and the beginning of the 50s, there couldn't have been another way out. unless Ethel's brother David confessed the truth. But David didn't want to. He didn't want to do it to save himself and his wife in an act of selfishness and cowardice. What can you say to him today? Nothing. He's dead too. He died after serving a few years in prison and may have become a free citizen again. Nothing more can be said except to learn from what happened in the past and what lesson we have drawn from all this. A hard lesson, but one to remember. When faced with accusations, especially serious ones, but not perfectly detailed and lacking real support from certain, concrete, and irrefutable evidence, it's best not to get carried away. Don't think you can solve everything quickly in a punitive way, because you might be exaggerating or even condemning an innocent person. This is a lesson from the Rosenberg case. This is what we need to remember today as we reflect on what happened back then and how it has influenced much of our thinking as the Western world. In the Soviet Union, the Rosenberg couple were not celebrated as heroes. In part, they were even forgotten. Even today in modern Russia, if you ask about Julius Ethel Rosenberg, most Russians won't know what to say simply because they didn't have a role, especially Ethel. And this shows us how fear, the fear of what we don't know, or the uncontrollable fear of what we dread and don't know how to face, is by far the worst advisor in the everyday lives of us ordinary citizens. Imagine what fear can do in the hands of those in power. There, where the fate of hundreds of millions of people is decided, where drastic decisions are made, where, if someone wanted to press that button, the very existence of humanity and this planet could come to an end.